My son landed a $33 million business deal and kicked me out. I don't need a poor mother dragging me down. I packed my bags in silence. 3 days later, he walked into the boardroom to shake hands with the mysterious investor. When he saw me sitting at the head of the table, he dropped his glass. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The champagne bubbles caught the afternoon light streaming through Seth's penthouse windows, each tiny sphere rising like my hopes used to before they burst. I watched my son pour himself another glass, his movements sharp with excitement as he paced across the marble floor I had never been able to afford for him growing up. $33 million, Mom. Can you believe it? Seth's voice carried that edge of triumph I had heard so rarely in his 41 years. The biggest deal of my career. Hell, the biggest deal anyone in my field has ever landed. I sat on the edge of his leather sofa, my hands folded in my lap, watching him celebrate. At 63, I had learned to measure my reactions carefully. Too much enthusiasm, and I would seem desperate for his attention. Too little, and I would appear unsupportive. Today, I had chosen quiet pride. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart, I said softly. You've worked so hard for this. Seth stopped pacing and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His dark hair was perfectly styled. His suit probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 3 months, and his smile had that polished quality that came with success. But there was something else in his eyes, something cold. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about, Mom. He set down his glass and walked to the window, his back to me. This deal changes everything. My whole life is different now. I'm going to be moving in different circles, meeting different people. The way he said different people made my stomach tighten. I had heard that tone before, years ago, when he was embarrassed to bring friends home to our small apartment. I'm happy you're successful, Seth. You deserve it. He turned around, and I saw it clearly now. The look I had hoped never to see again. Shame. He was ashamed of me. The thing is, Mom, I need to think about my image now, my brand. Miranda and I are talking about getting engaged, and she comes from a very established family. Old money, you know? Connections that matter. Miranda, his girlfriend of 8 months with her designer handbags and her habit of looking through me like I was furniture. I had met her 3 times, and each time she had found reasons to redirect conversations away from my presence. I see, I said, though I didn't see it all. Or maybe I saw too clearly. Seth ran his hand through his hair, a gesture left over from childhood. I've been thinking that maybe it's time for you to explore other living arrangements. The words hit me like cold water. I blinked once, twice, trying to process what he had just said. Other living arrangements? You've been staying in the guest room for 6 months now, since you had to sell your place. It was supposed to be temporary, remember? His voice took on that patient tone he used when explaining things to clients. I think it would be better for both of us if you found your own place again. I thought about the apartment I had sold to help him with the down payment on this penthouse. The apartment where I had raised him alone after his father died, where I had worked late into the night at 3 different jobs to pay for his school clothes, his sports equipment, his college applications. Seth, I don't understand. Is this about Miranda? He let out a short laugh that held no humor. This isn't about anyone else, Mom. This is about me building a life that reflects who I am now. I can't have you here, constantly reminding everyone of where I came from, where he came from, as if poverty were a disease he had finally been cured of. I sacrificed everything for your success, I said quietly. Everything I had, I gave to you. And I'm grateful for that, he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. But I can't keep carrying that burden. I can't keep being responsible for decisions you made 20 years ago. Decisions I made, like choosing to work double shifts instead of remarrying for financial security, like selling my mother's jewelry to pay for his textbooks. Like mortgaging our house so he could attend the college that gave him the connections he now treasured more than the woman who had made them possible. Where am I supposed to go, Seth? He walked to a desk drawer and pulled out an envelope. I've looked into some nice senior communities, very affordable. This should help with the deposit in first few months. He held out the envelope like it was a severance package. Inside, I could see the corner of a check. My hands trembled slightly as I took it, but I didn't open it. I couldn't bear to see the dollar amount he had calculated my worth to be. I need you to understand, this isn't personal, Seth continued. It's just business. I have to think about my future now. His future. Not our future. Not the family we were supposed to be. Just his future. Clean and polished and free from the embarrassment of a mother who worked at the grocery store for 15 years to keep him fed. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting the movement. At 63, I felt every year of struggle in my bones. When do you need me to leave? The sooner the better. Miranda's parents are coming to dinner next weekend, and I'd prefer if. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I walked to the guest room where I had been staying and began pulling my clothes from the drawers. Everything I owned fit into 2 suitcases. 41 years of being his mother, and this was what I had to show for it. 2 suitcases and an envelope I was afraid to open. Seth appeared in the doorway as I zipped the second suitcase. Mom, I want you to know that this doesn't change how I feel about you. I looked at him, this man I had raised, this stranger wearing my son's face. How do you feel about me, Seth? He opened his mouth, then closed it. The silence stretched between us like a canyon I knew we would never cross again. I love you, he said finally, but the words sounded hollow even to him. I nodded and picked up my suitcases. They weren't heavy. Nothing I owned was heavy anymore. I had learned to travel light years ago. At the door, I turned back one last time. Seth was already back at the window, champagne in hand, staring out at the city that had claimed him completely. Goodbye, Seth. He didn't turn around. As I waited for the elevator, I thought about all the nights I had sat beside his bed when he had nightmares, all the times I had told him he could be anything he wanted to be. I had been right. He could be anything, including someone who would throw away his own mother like an outdated piece of furniture. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, my reflection staring back at me from the polished walls. I looked older than 63. I looked tired. But as the doors closed and I began my descent, something shifted inside me. For 41 years, I had lived for Seth's approval, Seth's success, Seth's happiness. Now, for the first time in decades, I would live for someone else entirely. Myself. The lobby was empty except for the doorman, who nodded politely as I wheeled my suitcases toward the exit. Outside, the Chicago afternoon was crisp and clear. I had nowhere to go, no one waiting for me, no plan beyond the next hour. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Fear was something I had left upstairs, along with everything else I had given to an ungrateful son. I had work to do. The motel room smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. I sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the unopened envelope Seth had given me, watching the numbers on the digital clock blur through my tears. 9:47 p.m. Exactly 12 hours since my son had decided I was no longer worthy of his new life. Finally, I tore open the envelope. $5,000. The check was signed in his confident handwriting, the same handwriting I had helped him practice for his college applications. $5,000. Less than I had spent on his senior year of high school alone. I set the check aside and opened my purse, pulling out the small photo album I always carried. The pictures were old, some of them faded, but they told the story Seth had chosen to forget. There was Seth at 5 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a drawing he had made me for Mother's Day. World's best mom, it said in crayon letters I had taught him to write. I remembered that day clearly because it was the same day I had gotten my second job cleaning offices at night. I turned the page. Seth at 8, wearing his first suit for the school talent show. The suit had cost me 2 weeks of grocery money, but I had wanted him to look as good as the other children. In the background of the photo, you could see our tiny apartment, the one with the leaky ceiling and the radiator that clanged all winter. Another page. Seth at 12, hugging me after his middle school graduation. I was wearing my uniform from the diner where I worked the breakfast shift. My hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and there were flour stains on my apron. But I was smiling like I had just won the lottery. Because in many ways, I had. Seth had made honor roll that year, and the guidance counselor said he had a real chance at college scholarships. The memories came flooding back then, unstoppable as spring rain. I was 22 when Seth was born, married to David for barely 3 years. David worked construction, and I was a secretary at a small accounting firm. We weren't rich, but we were happy. We had plans. David was going to start his own contracting business. I was going to go back to school and get my teaching degree. Seth was going to grow up in a house with a yard and a dog and 2 parents who loved him. Then, David died. A scaffolding collapse on a job site when Seth was only 2 years old. The insurance settlement was $20,000, enough to bury my husband and keep us afloat for exactly 4 months. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table with bills spread out like tarot cards, each one predicting a different kind of disaster. The rent was $650 a month. Daycare was another $400. Groceries, utilities, clothes for a growing boy who seemed to outgrow everything every 3 months. I had 2 choices: remarry quickly to someone who could support us, or figure out how to do it myself. I chose myself. The first job was at Miller's Grocery, stocking shelves and working the register. $7 an hour, 30 hours a week, because they wouldn't give anyone full-time and have to pay benefits. The second job was cleaning the offices at Hartwell & Associates law firm. $5 an hour, 4 nights a week, from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. I would work at the grocery store during the day while Seth was at school, pick him up, make him dinner, help him with homework, read him a story and tuck him into bed. Then I would drive to the law offices and clean until 3 in the morning, catch a few hours of sleep, and start all over again. Weekends, I picked up whatever shifts I could get. Catering events, cleaning houses, even a brief stint working at a flower shop during Valentine's Day and Mother's Day rushes. Seth never knew about the night job. As far as he was concerned, Mommy worked at the grocery store and was just really tired in the mornings. He never questioned why I always fell asleep during his Saturday morning cartoons, or why I sometimes forgot to pack his lunch and had to give him money for the cafeteria instead. When Seth was 7, I found the third job. Data entry work I could do from home after he went to bed. 35 cents per entry, and if I could type fast enough and stay awake long enough, I could make an extra $150 a week. I remember one night, Seth must have been 8 or 9, he got up to use the bathroom and found me at the kitchen table, surrounded by invoices and receipts, typing numbers into a computer I had bought secondhand for $50. "What are you doing, Mommy?" "Just some work, baby. Go back to bed." "Are we poor?" The question hit me like a physical blow. I looked at my son, standing there in pajamas I had bought at the thrift store, his hair sticking up the way it always did when he slept. "No, sweetheart, we're not poor. We just have to be careful with our money. Jimmy's mom doesn't work at night. Jimmy's mom has Jimmy's dad to help her. We just have to work a little harder, that's all." He nodded, accepting this explanation the way children do, and went back to bed. I sat at that table until dawn, typing numbers and crying quietly so I wouldn't wake him. The photograph album fell open to a page I had almost forgotten. Seth at 16, standing next to his first car. It wasn't much, a 10-year-old Honda with a dent in the passenger door and a radio that only picked up AM stations. But it was his, and he was grinning like he had just been handed the keys to a Ferrari. What Seth never knew was how I had afforded that car. 3 months before his 16th birthday, my grandmother Evelyn had passed away. Grandma Evelyn, who had raised 6 children during the Depression, who had saved every penny and invested wisely, who had never trusted banks or the stock market, but had somehow managed to accumulate a small fortune through careful planning and stubborn frugality. The lawyer who handled her estate was kind but efficient. "Your grandmother left you $200,000, he had said, sliding the papers across his desk. She was very specific about who should receive what. She wanted you to have this because, and I quote, "Judith understands the value of hard work and sacrifice." $200,000. More money than I had ever seen in my life. More than enough to pay off our debts, buy a real house, maybe even quit one of my jobs. But I didn't touch it. Not right away. Instead, I took $5,000 and bought Seth his car. Another $10,000 went into a college fund. The rest I invested, quietly and carefully, using the financial knowledge I had picked up from my years of data entry work and my conversations with the lawyers whose offices I cleaned. I bought stocks in companies I understood, companies that made things people needed, groceries, utilities, basic services. Nothing flashy, nothing risky. Just solid, dependable investments that would grow slowly and steadily over time. Seth thought the car came from my savings. He thought his college fund came from my extra shifts at the grocery store. He never questioned how a woman who worked retail could afford to send him to Northwestern University, one of the most expensive schools in the country. The truth was, by the time Seth graduated high school, my grandmother's $200,000 had grown to nearly $400,000. But I kept working my jobs, kept living in our small apartment, kept letting Seth believe that his success came from my sacrifice alone. Because in many ways, it did. I turned to the last page of the photo album. Seth at his college graduation, wearing his cap and gown, his arm around my shoulders. I was wearing the best dress I owned, a blue dress I had bought on clearance 3 years earlier. My hair was gray at the roots because I couldn't afford to keep up with the color treatments. But I was smiling. God, I was smiling so wide it hurt my face. Because my son had graduated magna cum laude from one of the best schools in the country. Because he had job offers from 3 different firms. Because everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed for, had finally paid off. "I'm going to make you proud, Mom," he had whispered in my ear as the photographer snapped the picture. "I'm going to pay you back for everything. Every sacrifice, every late night, every time you went without so I could have something. I promise." I believed him. For 20 years, I believed him. Now, sitting in this motel room with his $5,000 dismissal check in my hands, I realized how naive I had been. Seth hadn't forgotten about my sacrifices. He had simply decided they embarrassed him. But what Seth didn't know, what he had never known, was that while he was building his career and his connections and his new life, I had been building something too. Something he was about to discover the hard way. I closed the photo album and reached for my phone. There were calls to make, arrangements to put in place. For 20 years, I had been content to remain in the shadows, to let Seth shine while I stayed invisible. Tomorrow, that was going to change. 3 days had passed since I packed my life into 2 suitcases and walked out of Seth's penthouse. 3 days since he had looked me in the eye and told me I was a burden he could no longer carry. I should have been devastated. I should have been calling him, begging for forgiveness, pleading for another chance. Instead, I was sitting in a corner booth at Morrison's Deli, sipping coffee and watching my son through the window of the building across the street. From my vantage point, I could see directly into his office on the 15th floor. He was pacing again, phone pressed to his ear, his free hand gesturing wildly the way it always did when he was frustrated. I had been watching him for 2 hours now, and his frustration was growing by the minute. My own phone buzzed with a text message. "Phase 1 complete. Waiting for your signal." I smiled and typed back a single word. "Proceed." What Seth didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that I had been preparing for this moment for longer than he had been planning his betrayal. While he was building his career on the foundation I had provided, I had been building something much more substantial, something he was about to encounter firsthand. I took another sip of my coffee and watched as Seth slammed his phone down on his desk. Even from 15 floors below and across the street, I could see his shoulders tense with anger. I knew that body language. I had seen it as a child when he couldn't solve a math problem, as a teenager when he couldn't get a girl to notice him, as a young man when his job applications were rejected. But this time, I wasn't there to solve his problem for him. My phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID and smiled before answering. "Mrs. Patterson, how lovely to hear from you." "Ms. Holloway, I have an update on the situation. Mr. Brennan's office has been trying to reach our mysterious investor all morning. They're becoming quite agitated." "I imagine they are. What exactly are they saying?" "Well, according to my contact in their building, Mr. Brennan has called the investment firm 6 times in the past hour. Each time he's been told that the principal investor wishes to remain anonymous until the contract signing. He's demanding a meeting, insisting he needs to know who he's dealing with." I leaned back in the booth, satisfaction warming my chest more effectively than the coffee ever could. "And what did you tell them?" "Exactly what you instructed. The investor is a very private individual who prefers to conduct business through intermediaries until the final stages. The meeting will take place tomorrow at 3 p.m. at the Sterling Building, 32nd floor. Mr. Brennan should come alone." "Perfect. And the contract modifications?" "All in place. The additional clauses you requested have been integrated seamlessly. I don't think Mr. Brennan will notice them until it's too late." I hung up and looked back at Seth's office window. He was standing now, both hands pressed against the glass, staring down at the street as if he could somehow see through the buildings to identify the person who held his future in their hands. If only he knew how close he was looking. The truth was, I had been watching Seth's career much more closely than he realized. Every promotion, every deal, every contact he made, I knew about it. Not because I was spying on him, but because the business world was smaller than people thought, especially when you had the right connections. And I had been building those connections for 20 years. It started with Mrs. Patterson, the senior partner's secretary at Hartwell and Associates, the law firm where I had cleaned offices for 7 years. Patricia Patterson was a widow in her 50s who worked late most nights, just like me. While I emptied trash cans and vacuumed carpets, she would still be at her desk, typing briefs and organizing files. We started talking during my 2nd year there. Just small conversations at first. "How was your day? Cold enough for you? Is your son doing well in school?" Gradually, those conversations became longer. Patricia would make me coffee during my breaks, and I would sit in the reception area and tell her about Seth's latest achievements. She would share stories about the cases the firm was working on, the corporate deals they were structuring, the investment opportunities that came across their desks. Patricia had worked for powerful lawyers for 30 years. She knew everyone worth knowing in Chicago's business community. More importantly, she understood how money moved, how deals were made, how power was accumulated and wielded. "You're smarter than you give yourself credit for, Judith," she told me one night as I was finishing up the conference room. "You understand numbers better than half the junior associates here. You just never had the opportunity to use that understanding." She was right. All those years of data entry, of tracking expenses and managing budgets on $28,000 a year had taught me things that business school couldn't. I knew what money was really worth because I had lived without it. When my grandmother's inheritance gave me my first real capital, Patricia helped me understand how to invest it properly. Not in flashy stocks or risky ventures, but in solid, established companies that provided essential services. Utilities, healthcare, basic consumer goods. "Rich people get richer by being boring," she explained. "They buy things that people need, not things that people want." Over the years, Patricia introduced me to others. Her cousin Marcus, who worked at an investment bank. Her neighbor Ellen, who was a CPA for several major corporations. Her brother-in-law James, who managed pension funds for municipal employees. Slowly, carefully, I built a network of people who understood money and how to make it grow. And because I had helped clean their offices, organized their files, made their coffee during late nights, they trusted me in a way they would never trust someone who walked in off the street with a business proposition. My investments grew. 200,000 became 400,000. 400,000 became 800,000. By the time Seth graduated college, I had quietly accumulated over $1.2 million, but I still worked at the grocery store. I still lived in our small apartment. I still let Seth believe that his college fund came from my overtime shifts and careful budgeting. Because I wanted him to understand the value of hard work. I wanted him to appreciate what we had built together. I wanted him to remember where he came from so he would never look down on others who were still climbing. I had failed completely, but my investments had not failed. Over 20 years, that initial $200,000 had grown to over $85 million. I owned significant stakes in 14 different companies, including 3 that Seth's own firm regularly did business with. I was, by any reasonable definition, wealthy. Not rich in the flashy, obvious way that Seth admired in Miranda's family. Rich in the quiet, invisible way that real power accumulated over time. And now it was time to use that power. My phone buzzed with another message. This one was from Marcus, Patricia's cousin at the investment bank. Target has been calling all day asking about Meridian Holdings, getting desperate, claims he needs to know who he's dealing with before tomorrow's meeting. I typed back, let him sweat. Any man who throws away his own mother to impress his girlfriend deserves whatever anxiety he can get. Meridian Holdings was my primary investment vehicle, a shell company I had established years ago to manage my portfolio. On paper, it was owned by a consortium of anonymous investors operating through numbered accounts and legal trusts. In reality, it was just me, operating through the network of professionals Patricia had helped me build. Seth had no idea he was dealing with his own mother. How could he? As far as he knew, I was a 63-year-old woman living in a motel room on his $5,000 severance payment. Which, by the way, I had not cashed. The check was still sitting on the nightstand in my motel room, a reminder of exactly how much my son thought I was worth. Tomorrow, he would discover his mistake. I gathered my things and left the deli, walking slowly down the street toward the parking garage where I kept my car. It wasn't much to look at, a 7-year-old Toyota Camry with a small scratch on the passenger door. But it was paid for, and it got me where I needed to go. As I drove back to the motel, I thought about tomorrow's meeting. I had planned every detail carefully. The Sterling Building was one of the most prestigious office towers in Chicago, the kind of place where Seth would expect to meet serious investors. The 32nd floor conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the entire city. It was the perfect stage for the performance of a lifetime. My phone rang as I pulled into the motel parking lot. The caller ID showed Seth's number. I stared at it for a long moment before letting it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, I listened to the message. Mom, it's Seth. Listen, I know things were tense when you left, but I wanted to check and make sure you're okay. I've been thinking about our conversation and maybe I was a little harsh. Give me a call when you get this. A little harsh. That was how he described throwing his own mother out of his house because she embarrassed him. I deleted the message and walked into my motel room. On the desk was a stack of documents Patricia had prepared for tomorrow's meeting. The contract was 47 pages long, filled with legal language that would take Seth's lawyers weeks to fully understand. Hidden in the middle of page 32 was a clause that gave the investor the right to withdraw from the deal for any reason within 72 hours of signing, with full forfeiture of any fees or deposits paid by the other party. Seth would never see it coming. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the edge of the bed, looking out the window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, my son was probably having dinner with Miranda, celebrating his big deal, making plans for their bright future together. He had no idea that tomorrow would change everything, for both of us. I arrived at the Sterling Building at 2:30 p.m., 90 minutes before Seth was scheduled to meet the mysterious investor who would change his life forever. The elevator carried me silently to the 32nd floor, where Patricia was waiting in the reception area, looking every inch the professional executive assistant she had pretended to be for the past 3 weeks. "Everything is ready, Ms. Holloway," she said, her voice carrying just the right amount of deference. "The conference room is prepared and security has been briefed. Mr. Brennan should arrive at exactly 3 o'clock. I nodded and walked into the conference room that would serve as the stage for my son's education. The space was impressive, all polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of Chicago. The conference table could seat 20 people, but today it would host only 2. At one end of the table sat a leather portfolio containing the contract that Seth believed would secure his future. At the other end, I placed my own folder, containing documents that would reveal the true scope of my hidden empire. I had dressed carefully for this meeting. A charcoal gray suit that cost more than Seth's monthly grocery budget, tailored specifically for my figure by a seamstress who catered to Chicago's wealthiest women. My hair had been styled by the same salon that served Miranda's mother. My jewelry was understated but unmistakably expensive, the kind of pieces that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. I looked like money, old money, the kind of money that Seth had always envied but never understood. Patricia knocked softly on the conference room door. "Ms. Holloway, Mr. Brennan has arrived. Shall I show him in?" "Give me 2 more minutes, then send him up." I walked to the windows and looked down at the street 32 floors below. Cars moved like toys, people walked like ants, and somewhere among them was the life I had left behind 3 days ago. The life of a woman who lived quietly, worked humbly, and loved a son who was ashamed of her existence. That woman was gone forever. I heard the elevator ding in the distance, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching the conference room. My heart began to beat faster, not with nervousness, but with anticipation. For 20 years, I had been invisible to my son except when he needed something from me. Today, he would see me clearly for the first time in his adult life. The conference room door opened, and Patricia's voice carried in from the hallway. "Mr. Brennan, if you'll just have a seat, the investor will be with you momentarily." "Thank you," Seth replied, and I could hear the confidence in his voice. He thought he was walking into a routine business meeting, the kind he had handled dozens of times before. He had no idea he was about to confront the consequences of every cruel word he had spoken 3 days ago. I turned away from the windows and faced the door, my hands folded calmly at my sides. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind countless times, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of seeing Seth walk through that door. He looked exactly as he had 3 days ago when he had dismissed me from his life. Perfectly styled hair, expensive suit, confident posture. He was carrying the same leather briefcase I had bought him for his college graduation, though he had probably forgotten where it came from. Seth stepped into the conference room, and his eyes immediately went to the windows, taking in the impressive view. Then his gaze swept across the room, noting the expensive furnishings and the formal setup. Finally, his eyes found me standing at the far end of the table. For a moment, he simply stared. I watched as confusion flickered across his face, followed by recognition, then disbelief. His confident expression cracked like ice under pressure. "Mom?" The word came out as barely a whisper. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I walked slowly to the head of the table and sat down in the chair that had been positioned to face him. I opened my leather portfolio and withdrew a set of documents, arranging them neatly in front of me. "Hello, Seth. Please, have a seat." He remained frozen in the doorway, his mouth slightly open, his briefcase hanging forgotten in his right hand. I could see him struggling to process what he was seeing, to reconcile the image of his poor, embarrassing mother with the woman sitting in this expensive conference room, dressed like she belonged here. "I don't understand," he said finally. "What are you doing here? Where is the investor?" I gestured to the chair across from me. "Sit down, Seth. We have business to discuss." He moved slowly, mechanically, like a man in a dream. Or perhaps a nightmare. He pulled out the chair and sat down heavily, setting his briefcase on the table with trembling hands. "You're the investor," he said, and it wasn't a question. The reality was dawning on him piece by piece. "I am the primary stakeholder in Meridian Holdings, yes. The company that has offered you a $33 million contract." I leaned back in my chair, studying his face. "Though I suspect you're having some difficulty understanding how that's possible." Seth's jaw worked soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to speak. "How?" It was a simple question with a complicated answer. How does a woman who worked at a grocery store accumulate enough wealth to fund multi-million-dollar business deals? How does someone's discarded mother transform into the kind of investor he had been desperate to impress? 20 years ago, your great-grandmother left me an inheritance," I began, my voice calm and steady. $200,000 that she had saved through decades of careful living and wise investments. I could have used that money to make our lives easier. I could have quit my night job, bought us a better apartment, given you the kind of childhood your friends had. Seth's face had gone pale. He was beginning to understand the scope of what he had never known. Instead, I invested it. Quietly, carefully, with the help of professionals who understood how to make money grow. While you were in high school, worrying about college applications, my portfolio was generating returns that could have paid for any university in the country. While you were in college, struggling with student loans I could have covered without touching the principal, my investments were doubling and tripling in value. I slid a document across the table to him. It was a portfolio statement dated 1 month ago, showing assets totaling $87.4 million. Seth's hands shook as he picked up the paper. I watched him scan the numbers, his eyes growing wider with each line item. Stocks, bonds, real estate holdings, private equity investments, a diversified portfolio that any wealth manager would envy. "This is impossible," he whispered. "On the contrary, it's quite real, and it represents only my liquid assets. The real estate holdings alone are worth another $43 million. Seth looked up at me, and for the first time since he was a child, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of physical harm, but fear of a reality he couldn't control or understand. "Why didn't you tell me?" It was the wrong question, and we both knew it. The right question was why I had let him believe I was poor when I could have lived like royalty. Why I had continued working menial jobs when I could have hired other people to work for me. Why I had allowed him to treat me like a burden when I had the power to destroy his career with a single phone call. "Because I wanted you to understand the value of hard work," I said. "I wanted you to build your own character, your own strength, your own appreciation for what we had accomplished together. I wanted you to become the kind of man who would never throw away his own mother because she embarrassed him." The words hung in the air between us like a sword. Seth's face crumpled, and for a moment I saw the child he had once been, the little boy who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms and tell me I was the best mother in the world. But that child was gone. The man sitting across from me had made his choices. "Mom, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was so wrong." His voice was thick with tears he was trying not to shed. "I don't know what I was thinking. Miranda, the pressure, the whole lifestyle I thought I needed to maintain. None of it matters. You're my mother. You're all I have left." I studied his face, looking for any sign that his remorse was genuine and not simply a reaction to discovering my wealth. But even if his regret was real, even if he truly understood the magnitude of his mistake, it was too late. "You're right, Seth. You don't know what you were thinking. Because if you had been thinking at all, you would have realized that the woman who raised you alone, who worked 3 jobs to pay for your education, who sacrificed everything to give you opportunities she never had, didn't suddenly become worthless the moment you achieved success. I reached across the table and took back the portfolio statement. This contract you're so eager to sign. It contains clauses that would allow me to withdraw my investment at any time within the first 72 hours, with full forfeiture of any deposits or fees you've already spent. Seth's face went white. You wouldn't. Wouldn't I? I stood up and walked back to the windows, looking out at the city that had witnessed both my struggles and my triumphs. You threw me out of your home like garbage, Seth. You told me I was a burden you could no longer carry. You offered me $5,000 as if that could somehow compensate for 41 years of unconditional love. I turned back to face him. What makes you think I owe you anything now? Seth rose from his chair and took a step toward me, his hands outstretched in a gesture of pleading. Because I'm your son. Because family forgives. Because you love me. You're right, I said quietly. I do love you. I will always love you because that's what mothers do. But love doesn't mean accepting disrespect. It doesn't mean allowing you to treat me as disposable whenever it's convenient for you. I walked back to the table and gathered my documents. You have 24 hours to decide what kind of man you want to be, Seth. The contract will remain valid until tomorrow at 3 p.m. After that, Meridian Holdings will be pursuing other investment opportunities. I moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at him one final time. And Seth, if you choose to salvage this deal, it won't be because I'm your poor, grateful mother who should be thankful for whatever scraps you throw my way. It will be because you've proven you're worthy of working with me as an equal. I left him sitting alone in that conference room, surrounded by windows that showed him the entire city, but couldn't help him see the person he had become. As the elevator carried me down 32 floors, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not satisfaction, not revenge, but the simple, clean feeling of a debt finally being acknowledged. Tomorrow, Seth would make his choice, and I would be ready for whatever he decided. The 24 hours I had given Seth felt both endless and impossibly brief. I spent them in my motel room, fielding phone calls from Patricia and Marcus, reviewing financial documents and trying not to think about the 13 voicemails Seth had left on my phone since yesterday's meeting. I hadn't listened to a single one. At 9 a.m., there was a knock on my motel room door. I knew it would be him before I even looked through the peephole. Seth stood in the hallway, still wearing yesterday's suit, his hair disheveled and his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, which he probably hadn't. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. Mom, please, we need to talk. I said 24 hours, Seth. You still have 6 hours remaining. I know, but I couldn't wait. I've been thinking all night about what you said, about everything I've done, and you're right. I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. I leaned against the doorframe, studying his face. The confidence that had defined him 3 days ago was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. But I had seen Seth manipulate people before. I had watched him charm teachers into giving him extensions, talk his way out of speeding tickets, convince employers to hire him over more qualified candidates. What exactly were you wrong about, Seth? Everything. The way I treated you, the things I said, asking you to leave, all of it. He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that reminded me painfully of the little boy he used to be. I was so caught up in this image I thought I needed to project, this persona that Miranda and her family expected, that I forgot who I really was. I forgot who raised me. And who raised you? The strongest woman I've ever known, someone who worked herself to exhaustion to give me opportunities I never appreciated, someone who loved me unconditionally even when I didn't deserve it. The words sounded right, but there was something rehearsed about them, as if he had practiced this speech in his bathroom mirror. Seth, are you apologizing because you're genuinely sorry for how you treated me, or because you discovered I'm worth $87 million? He flinched as if I had slapped him. That's not fair. Isn't it? 3 days ago, you told me I was a burden. You gave me a $5,000 check and asked me to disappear from your life. Yesterday, you discovered I could fund your entire company, and suddenly you remember that you love me. How is that not fair to ask? Seth's shoulders slumped. I know how it looks. I know the timing makes everything I say sound hollow. But Mom, I swear to you, the money doesn't matter. I would give up the contract, the deal, all of it, if it meant having you back in my life. Would you? Yes, absolutely. I stepped back into the room and gestured for him to follow. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed while I took the chair by the window. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the distance that had grown between us over the years. Tell me about Miranda, I said finally. Seth's face darkened. What about her? Does she know you threw your mother out of your home? Have you told her about our conversation 3 days ago? No. Why not? Because. He trailed off, staring at his hands. Because I was ashamed. Of what? Of me or of yourself? Of myself. His voice was barely a whisper. I was ashamed that I could be that cruel to the person who gave me everything. I felt a small crack in the wall I had built around my heart, but I forced myself to remain objective. Words were easy. Seth had always been good with words. What mattered were actions. If the money truly doesn't matter to you, then you won't mind if I withdraw from the deal. Seth's head snapped up, panic flashing in his eyes. What? You said you would give up the contract if it meant having me back in your life. So let's test that. I'll cancel the deal, walk away from the investment, and you can prove that your apology has nothing to do with my bank account. Mom, no. You don't understand. It's not just about the money. This deal, it's my reputation, my career. If I lose this contract, especially under mysterious circumstances, no one in the industry will ever trust me again. I'll be finished. There it was. The truth underneath all his pretty words. He wasn't sorry for hurting me. He was sorry for the consequences of hurting me. So, your career is more important than proving your love for me? That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean, Seth? Because from where I'm sitting, it sounds like you want both. You want my forgiveness for treating me like garbage, and you want my money to secure your future. You want to have your cake and eat it too. Seth stood up and began pacing the small room, his agitation growing with each step. This is impossible. You're asking me to choose between my career and my family. No, Seth. You already made that choice. 3 days ago, when you decided your career was more important than your mother. I'm simply asking you to live with the consequences. He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression desperate. What do you want from me? Tell me what to do, and I'll do it. Anything. I want you to understand that relationships have value beyond what they can provide for you. I want you to realize that the people who love you aren't disposable when they become inconvenient. I want you to become the kind of man who would never throw away his family to impress strangers. I can change. I will change. Words, Seth. Just words. Then tell me what actions you need to see. Give me a way to prove this to you. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where my modest Toyota sat next to Seth's expensive BMW. The contrast said everything about the different paths our lives had taken. 3 months, I said finally. What? If you truly want my forgiveness, if you genuinely want to rebuild our relationship, then you'll do it without the safety net of my money. Take the next 3 months and show me who you really are when everything is on the line. Seth's face went pale. Mom, I can't survive 3 months without this contract. I've already made commitments, signed preliminary agreements. If this deal falls through, I'll lose everything. The same way I lost everything when your father died, and I had to figure out how to survive with a 2-year-old son and no support system. That's different. How? Because you didn't have a choice. I do. I turned away from the window and looked at him directly. You're right. You do have a choice. You can choose to be the kind of man who faces his challenges with dignity and strength, the way I taught you. Or you can choose to be the kind of man who only values relationships when they benefit him financially. And if I choose the first option, if I walk away from the deal and try to rebuild my career from scratch, then in 3 months, if you've shown me that you understand what family really means, I'll consider funding whatever venture you want to pursue. But it will be as partners, not as a mother bailing out her ungrateful son. Seth was quiet for a long time, weighing his options. I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes. The safe choice was to try to manipulate me into maintaining the current deal. The risky choice was to trust that I would honor my word in 3 months. And if I refuse? If I try to hold you to the original contract? Then you'll discover exactly how ironclad those withdrawal clauses really are, and you'll never see me again. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, Seth nodded slowly. 3 months. 3 months, I confirmed. He moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back to me. Mom, I need you to know that I do love you. I know I haven't shown it, and I know my actions speak louder than my words, but you are the most important person in my life. You always have been. I felt tears threaten for the first time since this whole ordeal began, but I blinked them back. Then prove it, Seth. Not with words this time. Prove it. After he left, I called Patricia and instructed her to begin the contract withdrawal process. By the end of the business day, Meridian Holdings would officially pull out of the deal, citing concerns about the client's long-term financial stability. Seth would be devastated. His reputation would take a hit. Some people might question his judgment or his business acumen. But for the first time in his adult life, he would have to succeed or fail based entirely on his own merits. No safety net provided by his mother's secret wealth. No shortcuts funded by sacrifices he had never acknowledged. If he could find his way back to the man I had tried to raise him to be, then maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. If not, then at least I would know I had given him every opportunity to choose love over greed, family over status, character over convenience. The next 3 months would tell me everything I needed to know about who my son really was, and they would tell Seth everything he needed to know about the true cost of taking family for granted. 3 months and 2 weeks had passed since I gave Seth his ultimatum. 3 months since I had withdrawn from his deal and forced him to confront the consequences of his choices. 3 months since I had seen or spoken to my son. I was sitting in my new office, a modest space in a downtown Chicago building that housed my legitimate business ventures, when Patricia knocked on the door. In the months since our boardroom revelation, she had transitioned from secret assistant to full-time operations manager for my investment portfolio. Ms. Holloway, I think you need to see this. She handed me a newspaper folded to the business section. The headline read, "Local entrepreneur overcomes major setback, lands new contracts through innovative approach." My breath caught as I saw Seth's photo accompanying the article. He looked different, thinner, more serious. But there was something in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Determination, maybe, or humility. I read the article carefully. After losing his $33 million deal, Seth had been forced to downsize his operation significantly. He had moved from his expensive penthouse to a modest 2-bedroom apartment. He had let go of most of his staff and taken on smaller, less prestigious clients, but instead of giving up, he had done something unexpected. He had started volunteering his business expertise at a nonprofit organization that helped low-income entrepreneurs start their own companies. The article quoted several people he had helped, describing how his guidance had transformed their struggling ventures into successful small businesses. More importantly, 3 of Chicago's most respected business leaders had noticed his work with the nonprofit and had quietly begun funneling contracts his way. Not huge deals, but solid, respectable work that was slowly rebuilding his reputation. The article ended with a quote from Seth that made my hands tremble. Success means nothing if you achieve it by forgetting where you came from or who helped you get there. I lost sight of that for a while, but I'm grateful for the wake-up call that brought me back to my values. I set the newspaper down and stared out my office window. Patricia waited quietly for my reaction. "Has he tried to contact me?" I asked finally. "Not directly, no, but I've been monitoring his activities as you requested. He broke up with Miranda 6 weeks ago. Apparently, she wasn't interested in dating a man who lived in a 2-bedroom apartment and spent his weekends teaching business plans to single mothers." I felt a small smile tug at the corners of my mouth. "And his work with the nonprofit?" "Genuine, as far as I can tell. He's been putting in 20 to 30 hours a week, completely unpaid. The people he's helped speak very highly of him. One woman said he reminded her of her own son, and that he treated her with the same respect he would want someone to show his own mother." My throat tightened at those words. "There's something else," Patricia continued. She pulled out another folder and opened it on my desk. "He's been trying to track down the ownership of your old grocery store, Miller's Grocery, where you worked for 15 years. I looked up sharply. "Why?" "The building is for sale, has been for 2 months. Seth has been inquiring about purchasing it, though I can't imagine he has the capital for that kind of investment right now." My mind raced. Miller's Grocery had closed down 5 years ago when the chain was bought out by a larger corporation. The building had sat empty ever since, slowly deteriorating in a neighborhood that was struggling economically. "Patricia, I want you to arrange a meeting." "With Seth?" "No, with the current owner of the Miller's building, and I want you to do it quietly. Use one of our shell companies." She nodded and made a note. "May I ask what you're planning?" "I'm planning to find out if my son has truly learned what family means, or if he's simply gotten better at pretending." 2 days later, I owned the Miller's Grocery building. The purchase had been straightforward, though expensive. The building needed significant renovation, and the neighborhood wasn't exactly prime real estate. But I hadn't bought it as an investment. I had bought it as a test. That afternoon, I called Seth. He answered on the first ring. "Mom?" His voice was breathless, hopeful, uncertain. "Hello, Seth. I was hoping we could meet." "Yes. God, yes. Where? When?" "Miller's Grocery, the old building. Do you remember where it is?" There was a pause. "Of course I remember." "Mom? Why there?" "Because that's where this story began. If it's going to end differently, that's where it needs to happen." I arrived at the building first, using my key to let myself into the empty space. 15 years of my life had been spent in these aisles, behind that register, stocking those shelves. I could still smell the faint scent of produce and floor cleaner, still hear the hum of the refrigeration units that had been removed years ago. This was where I had learned the value of honest work, where I had earned the money that helped Seth through his early years, where I had been treated with respect by coworkers and customers who didn't care about my education or my background, but valued the fact that I showed up every day and did my job well. Seth arrived 20 minutes later. He knocked on the glass door even though he could see me inside, waiting for permission to enter. I walked over and unlocked the door, studying his face as he stepped into the empty store. He looked good. Not polished and artificially confident the way he had 3 months ago, but genuinely healthy. His hair was shorter, his clothes were simpler, and there was something settled about his demeanor that I hadn't seen since he was a child. "Mom," he said softly, "you look beautiful." I was wearing jeans and a simple sweater, clothes I never would have worn to meet with him during his successful period. But I could see in his eyes that he meant it. "You look different too," I said. "Better." We stood there for a moment, 2 people who had hurt each other deeply, trying to figure out how to bridge the gap that separated us. "I read about your work with the nonprofit," I said finally. Seth nodded. "It's been the most rewarding thing I've done in years. These people, they're fighting so hard to build something from nothing, and they're grateful for any help they can get. It reminds me of what? Of you. Of how hard you worked when I was growing up. I never really understood what that meant until I had to do it myself. I walked deeper into the empty store, my footsteps echoing in the vacant space. Seth followed, keeping a respectful distance. "Why were you trying to buy this building?" I asked. He stopped walking, and I could feel his surprise even though I wasn't looking at him. "How did you know about that?" "I know about a lot of things, Seth. Answer the question." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "I wanted to turn it into a community center, a place where people in this neighborhood could get business training, financial counseling, job placement assistance. I wanted to call it the Judith Brennan Community Center." I turned around to face him, and I saw tears in his eyes. "I've spent the last 3 months thinking about all the ways you sacrificed for me, and I realized that the best way to honor that wasn't to get rich or successful or impressive. It was to do for other people what you did for me, to give them hope and support and a chance to build something better. You don't have the money for a project like that." "I know. I was going to try to get investors, maybe run a fundraising campaign. It would have taken years, but I thought maybe, if I could prove to you that I finally understood what really mattered, you might consider helping me make it happen." I reached into my purse and pulled out a set of keys. I held them out to Seth, and he stared at them without taking them. "What are these?" "The keys to this building. I bought it 2 days ago." Seth's mouth fell open. "You... what?" "I've been watching you for 3 months, Seth. Watching how you handled losing everything, how you chose to spend your time when you didn't think anyone was paying attention. Watching to see if the man I raised was still somewhere inside the person you had become." He took the keys with trembling hands. And I'm proud of you. For the first time in years, I'm proud of the man you've chosen to be." Seth broke down then, tears streaming down his face as he pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than any embrace we had shared since he was a child. I held him and felt the last of my anger dissolve, replaced by something much stronger and more lasting. Love. Not the desperate, one-sided love of a mother trying to earn her child's approval, but the mutual love of 2 adults who had chosen to value each other above everything else. When we finally pulled apart, Seth wiped his eyes and looked around the empty building with new purpose. "We're really going to do this? Turn this place into something that helps people?" "We're going to do this together," I said. "As partners, as family." "What about your other businesses, your investments?" "They'll continue. In fact, I've been thinking about expanding into more socially conscious investments. Companies that prioritize their workers, that give back to their communities. The Judith Brennan Community Center could be the flagship project for a new kind of empire." Seth smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. An empire built on helping people instead of using them. Exactly. We spent the next hour walking through the building, talking about renovation plans and program ideas. Seth had clearly thought about this project in detail, and his enthusiasm was infectious. As we talked, I realized that somewhere in the process of losing everything he thought mattered, my son had found something much more valuable. He had found himself. As the sun set over the Chicago skyline, casting golden light through the dusty windows of Miller's Grocery, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in decades. Not the peace of revenge satisfied or scores settled, but the peace of love restored and trust rebuilt. Seth had learned that wealth means nothing without wisdom, that success is hollow without service, and that family is the only investment that truly matters in the end. And I had learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the space to fail, to struggle, and to find their own way back to the values that matter most. My empire would continue to grow, but it would be measured in lives changed rather than dollars accumulated. And my son, the man I had raised and lost and found again, would help me build something more lasting than money could ever provide. A legacy of love, service, and second chances. The silent empire I had built in the shadows would finally step into the light, not to dominate or control, but to lift up and empower. and at its heart would be the most valuable treasure I had ever possessed. A relationship with my son that was finally built on mutual respect rather than obligation. It had taken 44 years, but I had finally succeeded in raising the man I always knew Seth could become. And he had finally learned that the woman who loved him most was worth more than all the money in the world. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.